Will someone please explain to me what the hell is going on?
Welcome to the Shark Tank. Loki Episode 5 finally gets us a teeny tiny bit closer to revealing who's really running the TVA, but our valiant variant League of Lokis will have to resort to some crazy sci-fi magic to get there. Directed by Kate Herron, Journey into Mystery is Loki's wildest episode yet. We got a bunch of variant Lokis, the best giant smoke monster since Lost, and a cliffhanger tease that may well affect the entire MCU going forward, not to mention more Easter eggs than we've seen in the last 4 episodes combined. But before we jump right into all that, I have to warn you, we are about to spoil everything that just went down in Loki Episode 5, so if you haven't seen it yet or just don't want to know, now would be the time to cause a diversion and make a graceful exit.
This is the void, that's Goliath, and we're his lunch. Come on!
Okay, now that we're past the spoiler warning, let's get right to that big reveal. Loki wound up in the Void, a purgatory-like dimension where the TVA dumps everything it doesn't want in their precious sacred timeline. A bunch of variant Lokis are there too, since the TVA prunes more of them than any other kind. Mobius is also there, but we'll get to that. Everything that gets pruned by the TVA winds up in the Void. That's where Loki got sent after Ravonna Renslayer pruned Loki by stabbing him in the back, which is kind of a dick move, but honestly, when you think about it, he probably had it coming. What goes around comes around, that's all I'm saying. Anyway, Loki and Sylvie are finally about to find out who created the TVA and the lie that they're the greatest power in the universe. Working together, they enchant a huge smoke monster called the Goliath, and in doing so, find a portal out of the dimension they're in. Just beyond that portal is what we're led to believe is the end of time itself, but it kind of just looks like a haunted house in space. In any case, that's the cliffhanger leading us into the final episode of Loki. We still don't know who's actually in that creepy space house, but of course we have our theories, which we'll get to, but first let's do what we always do and recap everything that got us here. Picking up from episode 4, Loki wakes up in the Void and immediately makes a run for it with classic Loki, Kid Loki, Boastful Loki, and Gator Loki. All they do in the Void is survive because that's all there is left to do. They're trying to escape the Goliath, which is a huge smoke monster that very much wants to devour them and destroy them completely. Meanwhile, Sylvie is back at the TVA getting some answers out of Judge Ravonna Renslayer, who seems as in the dark as the rest of them. She claims to also want to know who is truly behind the TVA.
I can help you if you trust me.
Keep in mind, this is the person who just stabbed a Loki in the back, so of course Sylvie can't trust her, and eventually Sylvie prunes herself so she can end up wherever our variant Loki wound up himself. Which of course is the Void. Once there, she's immediately in danger of being annihilated by the Goliath when guess who comes rolling up to the rescue? Not Dominic Toretto, it's actually Mobius, who eventually helps Sylvie reunite with our Loki. Anyway, they hatch a plan to attack the Goliath so Sylvie can enchant it, which she thinks will open a portal to the end of time. And it works, but not without the timely help of classic Loki, who finally finds his glorious purpose. One of the best moments in this episode comes when our variant Loki is trying to figure out how to attack the Goliath, and when he and the other variant Lokis are attacked by who else? A bunch of variant Lokis who pretty much all immediately double-cross one another because that's what Lokis do, right? So much of this series has been about Loki wrestling with his true nature. Is he destined to never change and fail again and again, or can any Loki break free and truly choose a new path? The variant Lokis all kind of make our variant Loki take a closer look at himself to better understand what he's even doing anymore. We got Boastful Loki, who lives up to his name, claiming to have defeated Captain America and Iron Man before claiming his prize of all 6 Infinity Stones. Boastful Loki eventually double-crosses the other Lokis, only to be double-crossed by President Loki and his army of Lokis. We got that Gator Loki's an alligator, so he doesn't talk because that would be weird. He does, however, bite President Loki's hand completely off. We have Kid Loki, definitely the most noble Loki, despite the fact that he says his Nexus event was when he killed Thor. And then there's Classic Loki, played by Richard E. Grant, and this episode is really his, hands down. He does the coolest stuff and just chews up scenery playing a Loki who intentionally isolated himself when he realized that pain and suffering seemed to follow him wherever he went. Of course, the point of Classic Loki is to make our variant Loki realize the importance of relationships and just not giving up on the rest of existence. In the end, it's Classic Loki who comes full circle when he realizes that Sylvie and our Loki need a distraction if they're going to survive going up against the Goliath, so he conjures up a full-scale illusion of Asgard, drawing the monster's attention. The Goliath devours him, but Sylvie and Loki enchant the monster and look past it through the portal to the castle at the end of time. And so we end the episode with a look at the big castle at the end of time where whoever is perpetuating the whole TVA gag is supposedly posted up, but once again we see neither hide nor hair of this particular individual. And so we're stuck in the exact same place we've been all season, speculating on who or what actually created the TVA, brainwashed its agents, and is controlling the flow of all time. All season we basically had two main contenders for this. First, Mephisto. Nah, I'm just messing with you. Kang the Conqueror. He's the most obvious choice for this, and as we've said repeatedly over the course of Loki's season, jumping through time is kind of his whole deal. Actor Jonathan Majors is supposed to play him in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania when that drops way ahead in 2023, so if he appears next week, it would basically just be a setup for that. Either way, the show does seem to keep dropping clues that are supposed to make us at least guess that it's Kang. For instance, Judge Ravonna Renslayer, who seems to want to find out whoever's behind the TVA, eliminate that person, and take over. In the comics, Ravonna is a pretty important Kang-related character who even usurps his time empire at one point, but after this episode of Loki, we think there's an even bigger clue that Kang is our guy. Goliath also really points to Kang being the real big bad of this show. In the comics, Kang allowed the Goliath to break through the Time Variance Authority's realm, which wound up being a pretty major problem. The inclusion of both Ravonna and Goliath definitely point us directly at Kang the Conqueror for this. Last episode, we pointed out Stark Tower, which led us to believe the Void was the ruins of an alternate Earth rather than a full-blown interdimensional landfill. This episode, we learn otherwise, and more importantly, get a closer look at what we thought was Stark Tower. On closer inspection, it says Kang instead of Stark, and yup, that's another Kang nod. In the comics, Tony Stark sells his tower to a company called Kang Enterprises, which unsurprisingly belongs to that time-traveling conqueror who clearly didn't spend too much time on his alias. The big bad could just be another Loki occupying a creepy castle at the end of time because that's a mischievous thing to do, playing a cruel elaborate trick on the rest of existence. This series has obviously been very Loki-focused, with most of the variant Lokis we've seen wrestling with their very nature. If the man behind the curtain is actually another Loki in a castle at the end of time, that would help drive the series themes home in a pretty big way. But other than that, we're kind of in the dark here. This series has obscured the real villain of this whole story the whole time. But here's an outside contender. Miss Minutes. She's some kind of artificial intelligence, but what do we really know about this little animated maniac? Does this look like a face we can trust? It's time for the big ol' Easter egg roundup, and here's what we picked up in this episode, and there's a lot. The Void is basically just a big dimension full of Easter eggs, so check it out. Well, first off, the name of the episode is Journey into Mystery. That's the original Marvel Comics title where Thor and Loki first appeared back in 1962. If you guessed Goliath was from Marvel Comics, you guessed right. That would make sense. It's a show based on Marvel Comics. The giant evil smoke monster thing first appeared in 1983's Avengers: The Terminatrix Objective when Ravonna Renslayer, aka Terminatrix, accidentally frees Goliath from captivity, which becomes a thing the Avengers then have to deal with because that's kind of the stuff they deal with. We're told that the Void is where the TVA dumps stuff it doesn't want, which is plain to see by the number of dirty cafeteria trays and plastic cutlery littering the landscape, but there's a ton of other stuff in the background from both the MCU and our very own universe. Let's start with the big obvious Marvel stuff first. Throughout the episode, you can spot the remains of the following: a S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, Ronan the Accuser's ship, which is named Dark Aster, the fan-favorite Thanos copter that belonged to the Mad Titan in Marvel Comics, which you can tell is his because it says his name on the side of it. Fun fact, Thanos' double-ended sword thing from Endgame was supposedly inspired by those very helicopter blades. The large three-faced hooded statue is very likely a nod to the Living Tribunal, a cosmic entity as old as the universe itself. This is the second nod to it in the MCU so far, the first being the staff of the Living Tribunal, which is that magical weapon wielded by Karl Mordo in Doctor Strange, who we probably haven't seen the last of if you sat around through the credits. Speaking of big heads and familiar villains, there's another that looks an awful lot like the helmet belonging to Yellow Jacket in the first Ant-Man movie. And though Yellow Jacket could only get small, we learned in Endgame that the quantum realm is a means to time travel by getting really, really small. And now, we know that Kang the Conqueror is the villain in the next Ant-Man film, but it might also be worth mentioning that in an Instagram post about the casting for Quantumania, Evangeline Lilly tagged Corey Stoll, the actor who played Darren Cross, aka Yellow Jacket, and then promptly deleted that tag. Obviously, that was a typo, because Yellow Jacket died in the first movie, and there's no way he'd be showing up in the next one, where the other villain is a time traveler. On a much smaller scale, when Loki's heading down to the Loki bowling bunker, you can spot Throg, aka Frog Thor, trapped in a jar right next to Mjolnir, which is just out of reach. The label on the jar says T365, and surprise, Throg's first appearance was in Thor issue 365. Now that's all stuff from within the Marvel Universe, but the Void also has some Easter eggs from our timeline. The USS Eldridge is a Navy destroyer that was the subject of the so-called Philadelphia experiment, which rendered it invisible. The US government, of course, denied this ever happened. They also made a movie about it, in which the experiment sent 2 sailors 40 years into the future. Another paranormal relic turned set dressing was the Polybius arcade cabinet, which you can spot in the background in the bunker. Now this officially never existed, but according to urban legends, this was an experimental arcade machine developed by shadowy government agencies, and it was so addictive it could brainwash players. Meanwhile, the Burger Chef sign in the background is a nod to the now defunct fast food restaurant that at one point was the second largest chain behind McDonald's, but which was eventually broken up and the last location closed in 1996. Oh, and you probably spotted one of the Great Pyramids in the Sphinx, which is a pretty cut and dried landmark that has nothing to do with the Marvel Universe. Except for the fact that Kang the Conqueror at one point used a Sphinx as a time ship to travel back to ancient Egypt. Just probably a coincidence, just standard issue Sphinx product placement, no big deal. Now, while our gaggle of Lokis are drowning their sorrows in the bowling bunker, they are imbibing a bevy of anachronistic beverages. There's some Roxa wine, boxed wine, presumably the store brand, available in mid-21st century at Roxcart big box stores, like the one we visited in episode 2. Meanwhile, Kid Loki, who's not old enough to drink, is sipping on a box of High-C Ecto Cooler, which was the Slimer Green tie-in for the Real Ghostbusters cartoon, which the drink amazingly outlived, not being discontinued until 2001. And then there's some Schlitz beer, which was huge in the 1960s, but rapidly waned in popularity after some questionable business decisions, like changing the recipe and launching a series of ads that have come to be known as the Drink Schlitz or I'll Kill You campaign. So basically, the USS Eldridge, Polybius, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, Burger Chef, Ecto Cooler, and Schlitz beer were all things the TVA didn't want in the sacred timeline. Which kind of makes you wonder if maybe this is where Mobius has been getting his Josta. Anyway, if you prefer a tall glass of Marvel references instead of beer trivia and soft drink facts, did you notice the goblet that happened to be in the shape of a woman with a large hat wearing entirely red? You know, like some sort of scarlet witch? Either that or we just found Carmen Sandiego living in the void. That's where she was. And finally, because that wasn't enough, the license plate on Mobius's stolen pizza car is likely a nod to Thor writer and actual TVA clone Mark Grunwald.
By the way, you should be careful just jumping into a stranger's car like that.
But what do you think? Who is really behind the TVA? Is it Kang the Conqueror? Is it another Loki? Is it Mephisto? Is it someone else we're not seeing here? Let's talk it over in the comments down yonder. Anyway, thank you for watching this episode of Canon Fodder, and for more MCU, does Loki actually set up Secret War? And also, as always, don't forget to follow and subscribe to IGN wherever you like to watch. We'll see you next week, true believers, for Loki Episode 6.
I betrayed you, and now I'm king.
About that.